Okay, let's jump in to 2 Samuel for this week. And we'll kind of pick up where we left off last week with 1 Samuel. So if you remember, we talked through kind of the transition periods between Eli to Samuel, and then from Samuel to Saul, and ultimately Saul's decline and the rise of power to David, and then eventually that transition between the end of 1 Samuel, which is where Saul dies and on the battlefield, and then now we pick up in 2 Samuel with David. And so here's kind of a good framework for thinking about the character of David and just how he is portrayed in these two books. And then we're going to get a lot of him here in 2 Samuel. Richard Phillips, he has a quote that says it this way. I think this is really good. It says, David's story is essentially a story of contrasts. We start with the contrast between David and Goliath, the names themselves serving as a metaphor for the little guy standing up to the bruiser. David's success in the early encounter leads us to the conflict between David and King Saul. Then, just when we think we have left conflict behind, in 2 Samuel, we enter into the real struggle of this story, that which takes place within David himself, when David is forced to reckon with the mixed reality of his own heart. And I think that's so crucial, because so often it's kind of like when someone dies and we go to their funeral. Very rarely do we talk about the negative, right? We memorialize them. We talk about how good they were or all the things they accomplished, how much they love their family and they love their job and these sort of things. But those who really know that person, like, it's good to hear those things. But if you have someone who just kind of casually, they could sit in the back and think, that's not who I knew at all. That doesn't really match up. And so, sometimes we kind of treat David that same way, where we remember all the good stuff and we forget that he also was a sinful person just like us. And so I want to kind of highlight that as we walk through here in 2 Samuel, to know that David is a incredible picture of God calling someone who is just an ordinary person and doing extraordinary things through them, right? So if you looked at him on the outside, he was nothing special, but yet here is internally, here's this giant of a man who could conquer nations and destroy towering enemies like Goliath, and do these great things for the Lord, because his heart was in the right place. Whereas Saul, it was the opposite. He was strong and muscular and tall, but yet his heart wasn't right. So therefore, what he tried to accomplish on his own, he always fell short. Which is David here, trusting in the Lord's strength, he can accomplish so much more. But we also must keep in mind that even in these times of success and these times where we are on top of the world, if you want to call it that way, that we always have creeping internally this battle between good and evil, the battle between the flesh and the spirit. And if we're not careful, sin creeps in and we begin to choose that and begin to migrate towards disobedience, or choosing what we want instead of the path that God has continued to place us on. And we're going to see that in David's life, how God has blessed and brought prosperity and peace into the land. But then here in the middle of 2 Samuel, we see David choose sin. We see him actually choose when he should be out in the battlefield, he chooses to stay back and hang back, and it causes him to commit adultery, and then he tries to cover that up, and in doing so he actually commits murder. And so and since that point, the consequences of that sin and just the unraveling that takes place in his own family, but also in his kingdom, all is the consequence of what the Bible points out as this turning point, this sinful decision, and then tragedy befalls. And so if you remember, we talked about last week, 1 and 2 Samuel, very much this idea of triumph and tragedy. There's good times and there's bad times, but if we're to be honest, a lot of these bad times, at least in Scripture, are direct consequences of our own sinfulness and our own rebellion. And that's not to say that if bad things happen in your life that you're going through, or hard times come, that you need to look back and say, all right, where have I sinned because God is punishing me? That's not the way the world works, right? Read the book of Ecclesiastes, and we definitely see that idea that good and evil, the wheat and the tares, the story with Jesus, like those grow at the same time, that the sun sets on the unrighteous and the righteous at the same time. And we don't always know whose life is cut short versus who lives 100 years. based upon their faithfulness to the Lord. It doesn't work that way. But a lot of times when we begin to look at our own lives, and if we're to be truly honest, some of the consequences that come are from the decisions that we make that were probably maybe the wrong decision, or we're choosing our own ways, or not trusting the Lord, not seeking the Lord's face in his decisions. And so we see that in David's life especially. And so let's kind of pull some truths from that and how we can apply it to ourselves in our obedience to Christ and how we follow him, to not just follow him for a season and then turn away, or to not follow him until he makes it where we're at a good place in life and then decide to go on our own, but to have a steady, faithful obedience and for the long term, right? So, to kind of go throughout our life in one direction, to constantly be moving forward towards Christ, right? That's this sanctification process. And so we are going to struggle, we are going to fall short, but let's learn from the life of David. Okay, so as we kind of talked about with him, the first several chapters, and the story of David, and especially in 2 Samuel, could be broken up in many different ways. But what we're really going to be pushing to and really focusing on is this promise, and it's right here in your notes in 2 Samuel, that this Davidic kingdom that the Lord says, your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me, and your throne will be established forever. And so this idea that through David, even though he is a fallen man, right, even though he does make mistakes and will make mistakes, God will ultimately usher in his Messiah, this messianic promise that will come from David's lineage and from David's offspring. And so just a really powerful picture that the people of Israel wanted a king. They got David, and that's probably the best that they could ever have in terms of this warrior king who would bring peace and prosperity and victory in. But he's going to be fallible, he's going to fall short, and he's ultimately, because of his own sinfulness, is going to bring other turmoil into the land. And so we know that we need a true king, one who is sinless and perfect, and will bring ultimate victory, and will reign, and we will be able to reign with him in his kingdom, and that's Jesus. And so that's an important promise to kind of flesh out in 2 Samuel. But kind of to break down, the first 10 chapters really is David's rise to power. And so we can kind of see the first few chapters, what that looks like. He's anointed as king over Judah, and then eventually king over Israel. The united monarchy there between Israel and Judah becoming one nation. And then we get over here, chapter 7 is that covenant that God makes with David. We just kind of read about it there. Chapter 8 is where we start to see David's victories piling on. But I do want to kind of point out one verse there in chapter 7. At the very beginning, it says, "Now when the king lived in his house, and the Lord had given him rest from all his surrounding enemies." So if you just stop there, you think about that the king was living there, the Lord had given him rest from all his surrounding enemies. That right there is a perfect picture of peace and prosperity, right? David's able to sit in his palace. He knows all the enemies have been conquered up till now. They have no threats, and he's able to just kind of kick back and rest. So this is the in the Roman Empire, it's called the Pax Romana, the golden age of the rule, right? So this is what Israel is experiencing right now, this prominent period. And it's all thanks to David being the Lord's anointed and being faithful to all that he's called him to. And so we kind of see the promise to build a dwelling place for the Lord, and that's when the Lord gives David the promise that said, you're not going to build me a house, but I'm actually going to build a house with your name, David. And that's the promise of ultimately his son Jesus. And then we move over to chapter 8, these victories. And then chapter 9, if you were here, I preached about coming Mephibosheth a few weeks ago or last semester. We talked about that where, here's Saul's heir, grandson, Jonathan's son, who should have been able to have a claim for the throne. And, by all means, kings at that time would have just wiped out all the eventual threats that could come for their seat on the kingdom. But David doesn't do that. He goes and he seeks out this crippled boy and brings him into his kingdom and pretty much adopts him as his own son and feeds him and clothes him and takes care of him. And in a very real way, it's his enemy. And David seeks him out to show loving kindness, this steadfast love to him. So a beautiful picture of the gospel there of Christ, who because of our, Ephesians talks about us being enemies of God, Christ in his goodness and his kindness comes and seeks us out as enemies of the good news, enemies of God and his holiness, seeks us out and welcomes us to his table, forgives us, and makes us and adopts us as sons and daughters. And so, again, just a beautiful picture there in 2 Samuel 9 that really foreshadows what Christ is going to do for us. And then as we kind of move forward, chapter 11 is the turning point in this book, and it's the story of David and Bathsheba. When it starts off when verse 11, in the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained at Jerusalem. So it even says right there, when kings normally go out to battle, David hung back. And so it starts to set up that tension that something's not right here. And as he's sitting back, right, when an idle mind is just a seedbed there for the devil to come and roost and to bring up all sorts of impure thoughts and to really attack even one of God's most faithful. And so the same is true for us, to be on guard in those times where we should be doing this. We should be in this season of life being faithful, Lord, in this manner, but yet we hang back, we're content, and our mind is just idle, and we let Satan kind of creep in and distort and make us make decisions that are going to put us down a path that we don't need to be on. And so same thing happens there in David. He sees a naked woman bathing. He calls her into his room, has an affair with her, and then to kind of cover it up, to conceal his sin, he has her husband put in the front line. So essentially he murders him for that next battle. And so it's just a sad picture of something that happened to one of by all means the men who we look at as like such a godly figure, and had just fallen, had an affair. And we see this even in today's world. Some prominent preachers and leaders in God's church, they get wrapped up in the world and they fall. And so use this as a word to warning. If it can happen to David, I can promise you it can happen to us. David, who had someone who spoke with the Lord often and who was appointed by the Lord to be king over his people, he still fell into this trap and chose adultery, lust, and ultimately murder. And Jesus says, the same way you look at a woman lustfully or a man lustfully, or you have evil thoughts in your hearts, that's the same thing as murder and adultery. And so he even takes it to another standard. So we are the same battle we face that day in and day out. So let's be aware of our own sinful tendencies that are raging at war with us, and to continually seek Christ and to let his Spirit be at work in us. So chapter 11 is the sin, David's depravity, the sinful choice. And then really through that, really through chapter 12, even through the rest of the book, but really chapter 12 through 18, we start to see the fallout and the consequences of David's sin and a decline of his kingdom. So turmoil just takes place. I was like, one consequence, actually here, let me just read it real fast. There's three really punishments that take place right after David's sin. One is the sword will not depart from his house, that his violence will tear his family apart. Someone will take David's harem and publicly sleep with his wife because he took his neighbor's wife, and the child conceived in that affair will die. And just a sad picture of what happens when sin has consequences. And sometimes we think we can cover it up and hide it, but here very publicly it comes out, and it actually essentially tries to destroy not just a person or his family, but even an entire kingdom. So just like in Saul's story, and we see that in David's story, sin is disastrous. So let's always be on guard. So like I said, in chapter 12, we see in chapter 13, the rape of Tamar there, just a really sad picture. And then Absalom actually murders Amnon, who raped Tamar, and you can just see this destruction just continue to go down and down and down. And ultimately, with Absalom, he eventually wants to take over the throne. And so now you've got this battle between David and his son Absalom. They're both vying for authority and for the people of Israel to follow them. And it's just a really sad picture. And it kind of plays itself out. And then you really get to see in chapter 18, Absalom essentially hangs himself just riding his mule back. And it's almost comical, but at the same time it's so sad because you think about how good they just had it there in chapter 7 with this time of peace and prosperity, and then here just a few chapters later, it's chaos and it's turmoil, and there's death, and there's family splitting, and there's rape, and there's adultery, and all types of different chaos and turmoil. And so let's always be mindful of that in a split second, things can turn if we're not being faithful. So let's watch the way we walk. And then you kind of move on towards chapter 19 through the end, and chapter 24 is really just kind of the push towards David's last days, and him eventually handing his reign over to his son Solomon. But I do want to read this passage in chapter 23. I think it's a really good kind of prayer or oracle psalm, whatever you want to call it, here by David. So chapter 23, verse 2 says, "The Spirit of the Lord speaks by me. His word is on my tongue. The God of Israel has spoken. The Rock of Israel has said to me, when one rules justly over men, ruling in the fear of God, he dawns on them like the morning light, like the sun shining forth on a cloudless morning, like rain that makes grass to sprout from the earth. For does not my house stand so with God? For he has made with me an everlasting covenant, ordered in all things and secure. For he will not cause to prosper all my help and my desire. But worthless men are all like thorns that are thrown away. For they cannot be taken with the hand, but the man who touches them arms himself with iron and the shaft of a spear, and they are utterly consumed with fire." So the real thing I want you to kind of grasp from that is we kind of know David's triumphs and his tragedy there, but one thing remains is that when God makes a promise, even if it's with fallen men, God's word will prevail. So his covenant there that David's speaking about, it will continue to endure. His house will endure forever, because ultimately it's God's man, his son Jesus, who's going to come on the scene 1,000 years later, and is going to do what David could not, and that's ultimately deliver the people and present them with true peace and lasting peace and true prosperity, not wealth and money, but prosperity that they have everything that they would ever need with life with his son. And so again, we kind of move forward in this story with Samuel, 2 Samuel, the story of David, and then we're going to kind of move towards the time what we call the books 1 and 2 Kings, which is going to pick up with David's son Solomon.